So around 1480, the Burgundian Duke got into an argument with the King of France, who's Philip the Fair at the time. And he decided that he didn't want to truck with any of that French nonsense and that he was going to ally the Duchy of Burgundy with the Netherlands. And as a result, their art was influenced for nearly 60 years after that, or at least that's as far as I can see. If you look at the Kingdom of Burgundy, it does occupy a huge amount of space on the lower eastern side of France and is bordered by the Kingdom of the Ostrogoths, and the Dutch kingdoms were to the north. So they didn't actually border the Kingdom of Burgundy, but their interests were in line because they were both a very mercantile culture. And so in order to protect the Kingdom of Burgundy's interests, or rather the Duchy of Burgundy, the Duke of Burgundy allied with the Dutch. And it started to influence even their prayer books. So I have a different comparison of this where I show the previous art style, which was almost English. It's very rough. They show like bald pates on people, and it's very realistic in this kind of harsh way. They use a slash and stipple style of shading, which to our eyes, especially when it's blown up, is very harsh. They didn't blend smoothly or use color washes to like accentuate background pieces, except in clothing, when they were trying to mimic a certain kind of fabric. So if you look at the piece here, in the document I showed you, this is the piece we're going to talk about recreating today. It's an S from a book of hours by the Ghent Associates. And it was made for Philip the Handsome, or Philip the Fair, who was Duke of Austria. I'm sorry, I said he was the king. Okay, so he was the Duke of Austria and it was made for him. He later became King of France. I don't actually know how that worked because Philip the Fair was the guy who kicked all the Templars out of the temple, who arrested all the Templars that were still active in France and seized their land. Okay, so the example of the Dutch S, and as you look at it, it's extremely idealized. All of the shapes here are not what they would have been in nature. It's almost like a watercolor impression of what you would be looking at if you were actually looking at sticks and leaves twisted around in the shape of an S. They use this very buttery, clean shading, which is done in a wet on dry with gouache. And they smooth every little bit in between. And they're also not using blacks as shading. There are no black outlines in this style of illumination. There's only the very deepest dark of whatever color was used. In this particular piece, they use purple as the black of the shading, which is more true to life, but is still quite idealized. Has anybody done an illumination in this style before?
I'm currently working on a Dutch acanthus leaves border.
Mm-hmm.
It seems kind of harsh, the line between the paler and the darker part of the leaf, and it's not a very sophisticated style. I think it's 1460s, 1470s.
What area?
It's from the Master of the Harlem Hours, the Book of Hours.
Okay.
It's an inspiration piece in one of our Iris of Merit charters. So I went to the original book to look at other borders.
That is exactly how you should do that. All right, so the first thing that you want to do, and I do list out the steps for when you're copying anything, you want to look through all of the manuscripts, just like Eleanor was talking about, Her Excellency. She was talking about how you want to look at other borders, and that will inform your decisions about how you shade and how you produce your manuscript. Because there are sometimes details that you miss initially that will be really obvious if you look at other borders or other shading in the manuscript. They're usually done by either a very similar group of people or by one artist doing the illumination. Okay, so the first step to copying something, anything, is to trace it. And if people are like, no, don't trace. Tracing is period, tracing is appropriate, tracing is especially good when you're trying to manufacture an exact replica of a particular manuscript. You're going to insert your own style into it. You have your own aesthetic that you don't realize you do, and the way you form lines and the spacing and the negative space in your pieces that influence everything that you do. And if you trace it, you will actually get a clean line of what you're trying to copy, okay? So think of it as interpreting someone else's work and trying to like make it as perfect as possible. I do list a list of things that you would need. There are a couple of bits that I would like to point out. You want to have 2 water cups when you're doing this. You want to have 1 water cup that you use to add water to your paint because you're going to have to rehydrate your gouache, and you want that water to be clean. You do not want to have dirty paint water mixing in with your pure color so that it is made dingy and gray by working, okay? You want to have paper towels so that you can fix quick mistakes. Painter's tape is really useful, especially when you're attaching things, so you don't want it to move around. Also, if your paper gets too hydrated, it will crimp on you and wiggle, okay? When you buy painter's tape, do not buy cheap painter's tape. Buy the expensive stuff. Go in for the 3M or something, because that actually releases. And if you ever have trouble removing tape from your paper, you want to use a hairdryer or something else to heat the tape so the glue reactivates so that you can pull it up without damaging your paper. Okay, you know, use a light table or you can use anything else. I used a sliding glass door for many years. But if you have the money and you want just a dedicated space to do light tabling, these are awesome. They're available on Amazon, Dick Blick, everywhere. I've got the biggest version. This is a 2A. You can buy smaller ones. They are flat and very transportable, and they plug into the wall, and it's very easy. They also have adjustable light settings so that you can, but you can't be touching it, and mine's kind of old, so you can get quite bright. Highly recommend them. They don't take up very much space and you can store them pretty easily. Yes, I agree. They are awesome. Okay. Also, a thing that we don't think about very often in Scribble is mechanical pencils. Everybody's like, I want to use the lead. I want to use a pencil. These are a consistent, even line always. They're very cheap. I highly recommend them. You can buy the expensive ones if you want. I don't, because my children steal my tools. And so cheap mechanical pencils are ideal for making very consistent, very even lines that you don't have to worry about tapering or sharpening your pencil to a point all the time. And it just takes that worry off your brain. Okay. Yeah, about the light table, you can literally tape your stuff to a window. You can put light under a pane of glass. You can do this anyway. There are lots of examples of them using tracings underneath parchment, which you can totally see through the parchment, to trace and replicate designs. So for instance, a book that has many borders that are very similar, they would have a straight tracing of the border. They would lay it under the page, trace it up, and then do the painting. Okay. It also is very helpful to keep those cartoons. Here is the piece for this one for mine. Keep these laying around because you're gonna have another project that needs that border. Or I have a pretty standard set of borders for English writs of title, because they have this very standard border on top with very large calligraphy, and then they have these arms down the side, and you can alter that to make it look like anything, but you've already got your measurements lined out, you've already got all of these things worked out, and you can just lay it down. Yes, Michael's is a good spot for that. Plastic box with a flashlight absolutely works. I agree. Okay. I'll look at my paper so I'm not getting off myself. Oh, a thing you don't need but is super useful is this thing. This is called an Illuminator's bridge. It's a piece of plexiglass. They are often wood. I like mine in plexi because then you can see through it to what is beyond your hand. And that way you can rest your hand upon it while you're painting and you don't get your hand in the crap. They sell these at John Neal, but you can absolutely make one. I highly recommend putting felt pads on the ends if you make them yourself. This is about 1/4 inch plexiglass. These would be excellent largesse for scribes also, if anybody wanted to make up a whole bunch of these. They're great. My husband, beautiful man that he is, got me this one for Christmas and I adore it. Okay, about paints. Some people think that you have to keep paints in a sealed situation so that the water stays in it. You want to use water that is distilled. I never do that. My paints sit in there. I have all these dirty palettes hanging around, and gouache is so easy to rehydrate, and it lasts forever if you just use it. And there is no way that medieval scribes were sealing their paint up and keeping it hydrated and beautiful forever. That's just not a thing. Now, this does get grainier over time. So you might have to pull it out and use a grinder to grind it flat again, to pull out all the little imperfections and crystalline shapes that might happen in your paint. But I mean, I find that's really rare if I just put it in there. Other things you might need, you're doing gold calligraphy. A lot of people use Fine Tech, which is these are mica paint powders. They are almost indistinguishable from shell gold. Help me out on this, Your Excellency of Brunswick. But this is standard. Everybody's got one of these, and we use this for all of our gold shading, and they are wonderful. I absolutely recommend them.
Arabic gold is my favorite from their metallics line. It's excellent.
That is very good too. They also sell this. This is a Japanese gold calligraphy ink. You can buy this at John Neal. You have to shake it every now and then, or it gets weird on you. No, it's called Fine Tech Pearlescent Colors, I believe. If you go on Dick Blick or anywhere where you can buy art supplies, Jerry's Artorama is good. See, Her Excellency of Brunswick also has her set out. I think they might have changed the name recently. I've had that one forever. They do last forever, and also you can buy the pots individually if you need to replace them. Yes, Your Excellency.
It's now called Caliro, and instead of being in a metal case, it's in a plastic case, and they're no longer square inserts, they're round.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. All right, what else can we talk about? There are many variations of paint. I'm trying to find the two of mine. I usually use Turner design gouache. You want to make sure when you buy paint that it is design gouache or water-soluble gouache, because they also sell acryl, which is essentially an acrylic paint that's supposed to behave like gouache and gives a matte sheen when it's done, but it's plastic and you can't wet blend back into that. That's not a thing. So if you want to be able to do wet technique, you have to use this. Now, I do keep in my kit black acryl, because if I'm using black that I don't want it to go anywhere, and white acryl gouache, because you can use white acryl gouache to cover up just about any mistake you have made anywhere on a painting. There are lots of different variations. These are great if you have problems with your hand crimping over using your brushes too long, because they have a built-in grip. My favorite brushes, they're not there. Where did they go? Are Takalon golden liners, which you can buy just about anywhere. Here is, Takalon golden liners. Yes, Kat, that is the thing. It's like Takalon, but there's less letters in it than you wrote. If you look for golden liners or Takalon or Tack golden liners on Amazon, you'll pull it up. They're teeny and really great liners for painting. The reason that I suggest liners is because a lot of illumination requires very fine and even lines. And using a liner, and when you paint with a liner, you want to paint with the very, and just about any brush, you think of your finger as the paintbrush, and this is the ferrule where it's attached to the brush. You want to paint with this bit. You don't paint with this bit, you don't smash it, you only paint with this bit, like you're running your tip of your finger along the page. And you want to pull and not push. So you pull the paint in lines very smoothly, and it allows for very clean, very smooth lines. But when you're starting, having a couple of good liner brushes is pretty much all you need. You don't need to spend a whole bunch of money on, there is a great deal of, what do you call that? The curve, where if you spend a little bit of money, it gets better, but paintbrushes is pretty good. And then you have to spend a whole lot of money to get a little bit better. And then you can spend a lot of money to get really great stuff, but you spend a lot of money on it and maybe you don't have that money. So Taklon golden liners are absolutely the thing that I paint most everything with, just about every time. All right, so we're looking at the S from the Ghent hours. If you look at this directly, you can see that they used a shadow in the gold behind. The first thing I think we should deal with here is the background. Now, the background here is gold. And it is very thin. If you look closely at the background, you can almost see little bits and specks of the white paper poking through. That's unusual. Normally you would have a ground, something underneath the gold that would brighten it. Often people use a red layer underneath, like a red chartreuse or something like that, to brighten the gold, because it fills in the paint. You have to use less gold and less layers if you have a red background underneath. But because this doesn't seem to have one, I decided to go with the original. And I just painted with those fine tech paints that I mentioned earlier, the gold background. I also, there's a swatch card on the paper, so you guys can see which individual paints I used before I blended them. The blues and greens here. And what I did first was lay what are called, or at least I have always called, the flats, which is the flat mid-tone of the background. I filled in the blue and the pink of the leaf as it circles around the S, the blue of the branch, and the green of the little snail that's hanging out up there. You want to lay flats very smoothly. You want to outline a section. How did they explain this to me? It's like icing a cookie. You guys ever iced a cookie that's got like thin icing? You outline the area and then you flood to fill the rest of it. It makes this very crisp line, and it makes everything that's within that area dry at one time flatly. If you get water or you have like a bad lay of your flats, sometimes the structure of the paint will form this kind of crystalline and shiny layer where the water meets to the edge of the blend point, and it makes for this frustrating. So gouache is made of chalk. It's watercolor with a high pigment load that has chalk in it to make it opaque. Almost all gouache has this. And chalk is a crystalline mineral, so if it dries at a weird angle, you can see it in the paint. And it's really like, like I've gotten a water droplet or something on something, and you can see that water droplet forever. It's very frustrating. So if you do this where you outline the shapes, just like you would, I'm sorry, was somebody asking a question? No. So if you outline the shapes and fill them in just like you would icing a cookie and let them dry, then you can move on to the shading. All right, if you look at the second picture here, I made those colors by mixing the base color with mixing white rather than white opaque. There's titanium in gouache and zinc white. Mixing white is what you want to use to lighten your colors, and straight white is what you want to use to actually make white lines. Like if you were to use mixing white when you were doing white outlining on something, it won't stand out. It'll try to blend in with everything else. So I absolutely recommend that you have both whites in your kit. Like, you can get away with having a black, a red, a yellow, a blue, maybe a brown and a purple. But if you don't have, like, you need both whites in your kit. Everything else is extra and nice sometimes, but having both whites is absolutely important. Also, when you're mixed, this is a side thing, and I'm sorry, I'm all over the place right now. But when you're mixing paints, you guys know that no color you get is pure. There is no pure yellow, there is no pure red. It always has like an element of a cool tone to it or an element of a warm tone. Like a yellow will have a warmer color to it. Now, if you mix a warm yellow and a cool toned red, you get mud. It's not a clean orange. So remember to mix your cool yellows with your cool reds and vice versa. That's why people say that red and blue don't make purple, because if they're mixing a cool blue, a cool toned blue and a warm toned red, they get mud and it makes a brownish purple, which is also why having an extra purple in your kit is useful, because almost all blues are cool toned. And it's very useful to have like a clean purple that works with your illumination in your kit. So the next step that I do, and it's messy if you look at the handout, is start to layer a tone that is the same color as the background with a little mixing white in it over top. That starts to build the shape and roundness of the stick and the layers in the leaves. And you can just kind of lay that on. And then you go back with a clean, wet brush and you blend it on the edges. If you look at the second piece, so what you do is you take a clean brush and you kind of drag it along the edges, and you're pulling the two colors together, and it makes the cleanest blend that you've ever seen. It's, I also do this at the end of painting. I've always called it massaging. Safia calls it zhuzhing, where you take a wet paintbrush and you clean up the edges of the lines and anything that's sitting around. You can just, like, if you had a part where your brush just went out of line a little bit, you can take a wet brush and clean up that edge. Not too wet, you don't want to mess it up, but just like a damp brush and pull it through your thing. Okay. So I also started to add the darker blue to the edge here. And I'm looking at this, I did this experiment maybe 2 years ago, and I'm like looking at it and going, oh man, I would have done this differently and that differently, but that's the way of art. Okay, so I added some darker lines to the snail in the next step and started adding the darker blue. You can see how the two blues that I used on the shading are starting to blend together. And then I used a wet brush to start to drag out the shadow a little bit to pull those pieces together. I also started to layer color on the snail and add the shaping there. And just like with any other art, you want to add light to your high points and dark to your low points to create the shape. Because you're trying to trick the eye. You're trying to make it look like it's floating above the paper and like it is a real thing that is sitting there, plucked from someone's imagination. So adding the shadow to the gold behind it is also part of that conceit, to make it look like it's sitting just above the paper. Now, to add the gold, the shadow behind here, I just added a little bit of black to the fine tech that we were talking about earlier. And I just did that in a separate pot so it didn't mix in. And then I blended that along the background. And then in the last shape, you can see how I have more unrefined brush strokes. Originally, this piece is about an inch square. It's tiny. So to blow it up, you can see all the little places where that painter touched it with their brush. So if you look at the last piece, and I've added the very purple darks, and they're not consistent because I was trying to follow the inspiration. And I also used these kind of dab brush motions to add shading to the deepest parts of like where the leaf curves under. Because when that's far away from you, that looks like a clean shade. That looks more natural actually than a smooth shading would be, because nothing is actually smooth. A piece, especially like this, where they were trying to pull out your imagination and make it look kind of perfect. Using that line shading is very, very helpful at the very end. But always remember to match your shading to the style of your paint, of your illumination. It's really, I almost want to say disquieting to me, because you look at things forever and you know what they're supposed to look like. Then someone uses like flat shading or a stipple shading or like cross hatching in a place where it's not supposed to be. And you're like, why is that there? That looks weirdly modern to me. After you look at this stuff for a while, it just sort of seeps into your head what it's supposed to look like, or at least what those people were trying to make it look like. And even if like, that's not really the way I would paint it, if I was trying to paint it, it's still like part of their story. So just to finish up this portion, and I would be happy to answer any questions. The thing you have to remember about illumination is it's this artifact of history. It's influenced by all the things around it. Just like this piece is influenced by the Dutch because the Duke of Burgundy wanted to ally with them. So being Dutch was fashionable. Just like the pigments and the things that were available to them influenced the way they painted. Just like the learning that they had and the tutelage influenced how they were painting. All of those things are part of the history of that piece and part of how you can connect it to its place in time. So you can change things, but always make sure you make that choice with thought. Make sure that you're doing something like if you're making a piece for someone that's personalized and you want to include things that would make that person happy, then do it. But try to make it part of the style. Try to make it part of the piece so it all looks like one composition. All right, I think that's all of my soapbox that I have at the moment. Does anybody have any questions or anything you'd just like to ask? Sure.
I mean, you're absolutely right about let's saturate ourselves in the style so we know kind of what we're looking at. Do you have a preferred way to do that? Do you like to look at things online? Do you prefer to look at things in books? And if you do, what websites or books do you prefer to look at?
Oh, I'm gonna get in trouble with the old laurels. Pinterest. Pinterest is this enormously wonderful, like, set of images. And if you just follow a couple of Skadian illuminators, you will be hit in the face with every cool thing you ever thought. And I still find new things there. I've been on Pinterest for about 12 years or however long Pinterest has existed, and immediately started sharing things because I was like, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this cool thing. That's how I found the book. One of my favorite catalogs is the Jewel Book of Anne of Bavaria. Has anybody looked at that? Man, it is cool. It's this weird combination of photorealistic painting, it's a catalog for jewelry, and this beautiful like jewelry, and it's on this like bizarre Art Deco backgrounds, and you're like, why did that happen? So I have this theory that actually that it's two separate illuminators, like that the person who did the calligraphy and the illumination were two different people. And it does look like it's supported in the history of the book, that notes and background illuminations were added later, almost 20 years later. I'm still doing research on this, so like I only have one source, so don't trust me on this yet. But it's very cool. If you're ever interested, I totally recommend looking it up. Here, I'm gonna put the link in the thing.
I'm gonna add a beg. If you guys do use Pinterest, please, 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 in your little Pinterest notes, add in where you got the information from. Like if it is in a museum or if it's got a connection to another website, if you could put that into the note on your pin, it will solve or at least help alleviate the Pinterest death spiral where things just sort of reference themselves.
Yeah.
Definitely, you can't figure out where they actually came from.
There are a lot of people who link directly from museums. So you can click on the image and it'll take you directly to the catalog. So that's wonderful. Okay. So I'm trying to find that link and it's here and here you go. All right, that's the Jewel Book of Anna Bavaria. And we actually have evidence for jewelry that has been lost because of this book. If you ever have a moment, just leaf through that thing. It is wild. I did one scroll from there that was for Catherine McLaughlin, who is she has been a Pelican for a long time, and it was her Pelican scroll. And it took me a long time to make this. I think I was at it for like 3 years, putting it down and not liking it and picking it back up. And then finally, I just decided to focus on her jewelry work because she makes beautiful jewelry and coronets. And I actually gifted to have a thistle she made me. But the piece is bizarre. But I actually found a pelican piece and I used that as the central motif. And then I used ouches from the book and laid them on a background from the book. And I had to make choices like, am I gonna make this even and symmetrical? Because it's not in the book. It's like off by this much, like somebody freehanded it on the page and then just put a bunch of gold swirls on it. So you have to make choices like that. Like, are you going to make that border even? Or are you going to do it like it was in the book? So choices like that come up a lot. I'm trying to dig out that thing. Does anybody else have any questions?
I don't have any questions. Well, actually, I have a billion questions right now because I'm brand new at this. But this class was amazing and your art is amazing. I am just blown away by the way you layered everything and the way you did that. And Volgard and myself are very excited to journey down this adventure and learn how to do this. And I appreciate every one of y'all coming. I want you to know that I'm going to stop recording now.